Hi, this is Eric Elder, and I'm so glad you're here for this episode of Bedtime Stories of Faith. Tonight, I want to talk to you about two things. One is about healing and how God brings healing, that healing comes from heaven. That's a song I'm going to play for you. It's a new song that I've written, and we're putting into a new musical that I think is just going to touch a lot of lives. And so I'm excited to just play that song for you tonight. I also want to talk about when following Jesus means leaving. Because whenever we follow him, that also implies that there's a leaving that goes on as well. And sometimes we just need to really count that cost, consider that cost, and incorporate that into the equation as we consider following Christ. Of course, he's worth following anywhere, and really the question often is, how are we hearing that it's God? So I want to continue my story of how I felt God's call to leave my secular job and go into full-time ministry. And this may apply to you, depending on whatever God is calling you to do. It doesn't have to be leaving a secular job to go into full-time ministry. It could be just calling you from one thing to another. But that whole transaction and transition from following Jesus in one direction and then nod to our senior pastor who talked about this a week ago too, the chapter I've written long ago, but the truth of what he said in his own sermon about following Jesus and leaving other things is very real. And so I love to put into practice what I hear from my own church. So here's this chapter, When Following Means Leaving. I cried when God said that this would let me back up, because maybe you didn't tune in last night. Last night I talked about how God had said he was going to call me into full-time ministry. He wanted me to begin a ministry for him. I didn't know what that meant. I actually didn't even know that it meant full-time ministry. He just said today would mark the day of the beginning of my ministry. And I cried, and I was flying down to Texas to pray for a woman who needed healing that same day. And God had said some amazing things to me about that night and about her healing. And so that's the preface to this. Just thought I'd catch you up in case you missed something earlier. You can go back and listen later. I cried when God said this would mark the beginning of my ministry, because I had been wanting to do ministry and wondered how I could possibly believe it. How could I believe he was going to heal this woman? How could I believe this was the day that would shift the direction for the rest of my life? I also wondered what kind of healing it might be, and if it would be clear that this woman actually had been healed. Will I know that she is healed? I asked God. You'll know it, he said. Will she know that she's healed? I asked. She'll know it, he said. Okay, God, I said. I'm going to trust you. On the plane to Texas, God continued speaking to me. That project you're working on, I want you to give it to Doug, God said. I had been working on a project for my company for almost 2 years. We were 2 months away from launching it publicly, and I was more than a little bit shocked that he wanted me to give it away. What would I work on? I said. You don't need that job, he said. I want you to quit tomorrow. Wow, that escalated fast. Maybe God really was serious about this being the beginning of my ministry. As excited as I was by this thought, I was also petrified. This was no small decision. I was married, had 3 kids at home, and about $1,500 in the bank. How could I just quit tomorrow? At least, how could I quit without affecting a whole lot of other things and people? I decided to call Lana from the phone on the plane to keep her updated on what I felt God was saying. I had already talked to her that morning in person when I was crying in the tub, telling her what God had been saying to me. Lana had been completely with me at that time, realizing that something significant was taking place. She was trusting God with all of this as much as I was. But quitting my job the next day, would she still be with me on that? I pulled out the phone that was embedded in the seat in front of me on the plane and called her. I told her what I felt God was asking me to do, to give that project to Doug, and to quit my job the next day. Her response stunned me. Don't worry about me, and don't worry about the money, she said. For my wife to say not to worry about her and not to worry about the money, that had to be God speaking to me. This was completely out of character for Lana, or for any spouse for that matter. I told her thanks for her support, and that I would have to think about it more later, as my plane was about to land. My friend was picking me up at the airport, and we were going out for dinner before heading out to his friend's house to pray for the woman's healing. First things first, praying for this woman was the most important thing I needed to focus on next. More next time on my bedtime story. But that was a big question for me on my mind that day. I just couldn't believe that God was saying, I want you to quit tomorrow. I was all up for praying for this woman to be healed and to see her healed, as I felt God was saying he was going to do. I was clarifying to say, is this one of those healings where we're not really sure if she's healed, or will I know that she's healed? Will she know that she's healed? And God confirmed, yes, you'll know it and she'll know it. And it also just made me think, wow, I wonder what else is going to happen if God says this is the beginning of my ministry. And then when he said to quit my job the next day, I'd been at the company for 9 years. I was doing great, doing fine. And yet, if you'll remember from a few episodes ago, I was praying just weeks prior to this about using my gifts in a fuller way for God and whether I was using them the way he wanted me to do or not. And he had said that I wasn't, and he wanted me to use certain gifts in certain ways, and he spoke that to me very clearly. Then he spoke through another friend saying that she thought that God was going to free up my time very soon. Of course, looking back in hindsight, this all makes sense. But as I was walking through it, I was really puzzled by all of it. I was really trying to figure out and wrestle with God and wrestle with my feelings and my understanding what this meant. But I'm not the only one that's ever wrestled with a call from God. Certainly in the Bible, Jesus came to people. He came to the fishermen, Simon, Peter, and Andrew. And this is from Matthew 4:18 through 22. And when he called them, it says in the Bible, as Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, called Peter, and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come, follow me, Jesus said, and I will make you fishers of men. At once they left their nets and followed him. Now this was their occupation, their job. Their nets were everything for a fisherman. And so for Jesus to say, follow me, and them to leave their nets behind was a very significant day and a very significant moment for them. They weren't the only ones, though. In verse 21, just the next verse, it says, going on from there, Jesus saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. So immediately they left too. Jesus called, they left their boat, they left their father, and they followed Jesus. And they followed Jesus for several years, and until Jesus' death, and then they followed Jesus in the risen form and in the Holy Spirit speaking to them and guiding them for the rest of their lives. And how can you do that? How can you just immediately say, okay, all right, I'm just going to leave. I'm going to follow you. To some people, this is the scariest thing. There's a great quote by Madame Guyon, and she talks about complete surrender. And she says, it's surrendering your will into the depths of God's will, there to be lost forever. Surrendering your will into the depths of God's will, there to be lost forever. When I first heard that, I was at a conference and I heard a speaker say this, and my heart just leapt. I just said, wow, I cannot imagine anything that sounds better than that. I just want to plunge my will into the depths of God's will. I think that was the word plunge. Plunge your will into the depths of his will. And that meant surrender. I wanted to do that too, and I just feel like that's what I want to do. I mentioned that to a friend who was also at the conference. He said, that's the scariest thing in the world. That really scared me to death. I do not want to do that. And sometimes that's our reaction. We're really reluctant to give up our will to God's will. But when God shows you over and over and over again that he is faithful, that he will catch you, for me, then it's just a matter of, God, am I really hearing you correctly? And I want to make sure I'm hearing him correctly. And on several of these episodes, I've talked about how to help do that. But once you hear correctly from God, once you know that this is God, and you know that you know that you know, then this absolute surrender is the most freeing feeling in the world. It's a great free fall, but you're not falling alone. You're right there with Jesus. And to fall with Jesus is one of the most glorious things you can do. So I just want to encourage you. Consider an absolute surrender to God too. Just with everything in your life. He's worthy of your trust. He's died for you already. He's done everything he could possibly do for you. And he's asking you to do some things for him that will bring you great joy and bring him great joy. and bring great joy to others too. Maybe it's playing music, maybe it's writing a song, maybe it's writing a poem, maybe it's going into ministry, maybe it's taking care of your kids, maybe it's taking care of someone else's kids, maybe it's taking care of your parents. There could be so many things that Jesus is calling you to do right now. What is that next right step that Jesus is calling you to do? And then what are you going to have to leave behind to do it? Now, I don't want you to leave behind something that God has also called you to do. I told this story once to a woman, or to an audience, and a woman came up afterwards, said she felt like God was calling her to go work with the children's ministry in another state. And I said, wow, that's amazing. I'm really glad. And she said, yep, I feel like I need to do it now. And I said, great. You sound like you're hesitant for some reason. She said, well, I'll have to leave my husband to do it. I said, well, if God called you to your husband, you need to stick with your husband. And if he's not for it, you're going to need to work through that first before you follow this other call. Because God doesn't want us to break our vows, break our commitments, take other approaches when he calls us. And I had to do the same with Lana. I wrote her a letter during this process and said, if I am ever doing something that makes you feel like you're in jeopardy, or you're putting our marriage or our family at unnecessary risk, please let me know, and I will change course, because God has called me to marry you first, to raise these kids first, and I want to do that, and do that to the best of my ability, which was the most important thing of that day. And really trying to believe, would God really heal her? And I wrote a song about healing. I wrote it for this musical that I'm working on, about the life of St. Nicholas, the real St. Nicholas, who lived back in the 3rd and 4th century A.D. And he actually had lost his parents during a plague. There was a plague that swept through their region, through their city, and many other cities around. And the devastation from the plague was very real. It's documented in history. I'm not giving you too many spoilers, but healing. And wasn't it his mom that healed him when he had a cut? Wasn't it the doctor who healed his dad when he had a broken leg? I'll try to sing it for you too. We have some professional musicians who have recorded this, and it's a beautiful addition. But I would like to just sing it for you too, in my version, which is slightly different from our recording, but it's beautiful, and it'll give you a hint at what this song is, and also about healing in your own life or for those you love. Just that all healing comes from heaven. Healing comes from heaven, of that you can be sure, whether blood that slows while bleeding or the bones that mend and grow. Yes, healing comes from heaven, of that you can be sure. We have just to reach toward heaven and then watch the healing flow. Sometimes it comes so quick we hardly understand. Sometimes it takes so long, but then we stand. And we can always know that one day we will be made whole when heaven comes to stay. Healing comes from heaven, of that you can be sure. Even fathers, mothers, doctors know that God's the one who cures. Yes, healing comes from heaven, of that you can be sure. So we pray to God in heaven now, that to touch us here on earth